What if I told you that a child's bicycle found buried 500 meters from his home after 30 years would reveal the most disturbing truth a family could ever face? In 1991, 8-year-old Tommy Henderson vanished without a trace while riding his red BMX bike in Millfield, Oregon. For 3 decades, his disappearance remained one of the town's greatest mysteries. But when construction workers broke ground for a new shopping center in 2021, they unearthed something that would turn everything we thought we knew about Tommy's case completely upside down. Before we dive into this spine-chilling investigation, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because what you're about to discover will leave you questioning everything you think you know about missing person cases. I've been investigating cold cases for over 15 years, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that some mysteries are meant to stay buried. The Tommy Henderson case taught me that lesson the hard way. What started as a simple missing child investigation in 1991 became something that would haunt an entire community for 3 decades, and when the truth finally surfaced, it was more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. Let me take you back to September 15th, 1991. Millfield, Oregon was the kind of small town where everybody knew everybody else's business. Population 3,200, nestled between rolling hills and dense forests that seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon. It was a place where children rode their bikes until dark, where front doors remained unlocked, and where the most exciting thing that happened was usually the annual Harvest Festival. Tommy Henderson was 8 years old, with sandy blonde hair and freckles scattered across his nose like tiny stars. He had this infectious laugh that could brighten anyone's day, and an adventurous spirit that sometimes worried his parents, Sarah and Michael Henderson. The Hendersons lived at 412 Maple Street, a modest 2-story house with a white picket fence and a garden that Sarah tended to religiously. Michael worked at the local lumber mill, coming home each evening with sawdust in his hair and calloused hands that told stories of hard work. Sarah taught 3rd grade at Millfield Elementary, where Tommy was one of her most energetic students. They were what you'd call the perfect American family, the kind you'd see in Norman Rockwell paintings or small-town postcards. Tommy's most prized possession was his bright red BMX bike, a birthday gift from his grandparents that previous spring. He'd spent countless hours decorating it with baseball cards, colorful streamers, and a bell that he'd ring enthusiastically as he raced through the neighborhood. The bike represented freedom to Tommy, a ticket to adventure that could take him anywhere his 8-year-old imagination wanted to go. He knew every street, every shortcut, every hill in Millfield, and his parents trusted him to be responsible within the boundaries they'd set. On that fateful September afternoon, Tommy had finished his homework early and asked his mother for permission to ride his bike around the neighborhood. Sarah was grading papers at the kitchen table when Tommy bounded down the stairs, his backpack slung over his shoulder and excitement radiating from every pore. "Can I go ride, Mom? I promise I'll be back before dinner," he said, already reaching for his helmet. Sarah looked up from her work, studying her son's eager face. The weather was perfect, sunny but not too hot, with just a hint of autumn in the air. "Stay in the neighborhood, Tommy. Don't go past the miller's house, and absolutely do not go near the old quarry road. Be back by 6 o'clock sharp." Tommy nodded enthusiastically, planted a quick kiss on his mother's cheek, and raced toward the garage where his beloved red bike waited. That was the last time Sarah Henderson saw her son alive. At 6:30 p.m., when Tommy hadn't returned home, she felt the first flutter of concern in her stomach. By 7 p.m., that flutter had grown into full-blown panic. Michael came home from work to find Sarah pacing the living room, wringing her hands and staring out the window as if she could will Tommy to appear. They immediately began calling neighbors, checking with Tommy's friends, retracing his usual routes. By 8 p.m., half the neighborhood was out searching, flashlights cutting through the gathering darkness like desperate prayers. The Millfield Police Department, all 4 officers strong, mobilized immediately. Chief Robert Martinez, A 20-year veteran who'd never dealt with a missing child case coordinated search efforts that would continue for weeks. They combed through every inch of the small town, searched the surrounding forests with tracking dogs, dragged the local creek, and questioned everyone who might have seen Tommy that afternoon. The last confirmed sighting was at 4:15 p.m., when Mrs. Eleanor Fitzgerald saw Tommy riding his bike past her house on Oak Street, just 3 blocks from his home. She remembered waving at him, and he'd waved back with his characteristic big smile. What struck investigators as particularly odd was the complete absence of Tommy's bicycle. In most missing child cases, especially those involving abduction, personal belongings are often discarded nearby. But Tommy's bright red BMX bike had vanished as completely as the boy himself. This detail would become crucial to the investigation, though at the time it simply added another layer of mystery to an already baffling case. The bike was distinctive enough that anyone in Millfield would have recognized it immediately. Yet despite extensive searches and public appeals, no trace of it emerged. The community response was overwhelming. Sarah and Michael found themselves surrounded by an army of volunteers, teachers from Sarah's school, workers from Michael's mill, church members, and complete strangers who'd driven in from neighboring towns to help search. Missing person flyers with Tommy's smiling face appeared on every telephone pole, store window, and bulletin board within a 50-mile radius. The local newspaper, the Millfield Gazette, ran Tommy's story on the front page for 3 consecutive weeks, and regional television news picked up the case, broadcasting it across Oregon and into Washington state. As days turned into weeks, the initial surge of hope began to slowly erode, replaced by a grim determination that masked growing despair. The FBI became involved after the first week, bringing sophisticated resources and expertise to bear on the case. Agent Patricia Coleman, a specialist in missing children cases, established a command center in the Millfield Community Hall and coordinated efforts with local law enforcement, state police, and volunteer organizations. Despite their best efforts, despite following hundreds of tips and leads, despite searching thousands of acres of surrounding wilderness, Tommy Henderson remained as elusive as morning mist. The case took its toll on everyone involved, but nowhere was this more evident than in the Henderson household itself. Sarah stopped teaching, unable to concentrate on anything but finding her son. She would spend hours sitting by the phone, waiting for news that never came, or walking the streets of Millfield calling Tommy's name until her voice gave out. Michael threw himself into the search efforts with an almost manic intensity, organizing volunteer groups, printing flyers, and following up on every tip, no matter how unlikely it seemed. Their marriage, once solid as bedrock, began to show stress fractures under the unimaginable pressure of their loss. The investigation revealed nothing suspicious in the Henderson family history. Michael and Sarah were respected members of the community with no criminal records, no financial troubles, and no enemies that anyone could identify. Tommy was a happy, well-adjusted child with no history of running away or getting into serious trouble. The family had no custody disputes, no romantic entanglements, and no connections to anyone who might want to harm them. This wholesome normalcy, rather than providing comfort, only deepened the mystery and made Tommy's disappearance seem even more inexplicable. By Christmas of 1991, the active search efforts had largely wound down, though the case remained officially open and investigators continued to follow up on tips and leads. The Henderson house, once filled with Tommy's laughter and the sounds of a busy family life, became a shrine to their missing son. Sarah kept his room exactly as he'd left it, his clothes still in the drawers, his toys still scattered across the floor, his favorite stuffed dinosaur still sitting on his carefully made bed. The red bike helmet that Tommy had been too excited to put on before his final ride hung on a hook by the garage door like a silent accusation. Years passed with agonizing slowness. The intense media attention gradually faded, replaced by newer tragedies and more recent mysteries. The volunteer searches became annual events, then occasional reminders, then finally painful memories. Sarah and Michael divorced in 1995, the shared trauma of their loss ultimately driving them apart rather than bringing them together. Sarah moved to Portland to live with her sister, while Michael remained in Millfield, unable to leave the place where he'd last seen his son. The house at 412 Maple Street was sold to a young couple from California who'd never heard of Tommy Henderson and didn't understand why some of the neighbors looked at their new home with such sadness. Agent Coleman retired from the FBI in 2003, but she never forgot the Tommy Henderson case. It was one of only 3 missing person investigations she'd been unable to solve during her 25-year career, and it haunted her long into retirement. She kept a file in her home office containing every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every theory that had been explored during the investigation. Occasionally she would pull out the file and review it, hoping to spot some detail she'd missed, some connection she'd failed to make. The bright red BMX bike remained a particular focus of her attention. Such a distinctive item should have turned up somewhere, sold at a pawn shop, abandoned in a field, noticed by someone. The case officially went cold in 2001, 10 years after Tommy's disappearance. By then, Chief Martinez had retired, Agent Coleman had moved on to other cases, and most of the original investigators had either left the force or forgotten the specific details of the Henderson investigation. Tommy's file was moved to the cold case archives, where it gathered dust alongside dozens of other unsolved mysteries. Millfield had grown from 3,200 to nearly 8,000 residents, and many of the newer residents had never heard of Tommy Henderson. The case had become local legend, the kind of story that older residents would tell to newcomers as an example of how even small towns weren't immune to tragedy. Sarah Henderson tried to rebuild her life in Portland, but Tommy's ghost followed her everywhere. She became involved with support groups for parents of missing children, channeling her grief into advocacy work that helped other families navigate the nightmare she knew all too well. She never remarried, never had other children, and never stopped hoping that someday she would learn what had happened to her son. On Tommy's birthday each year, she would drive back to Millfield and leave flowers at the memorial bench that had been installed in Central Park in his honor. These annual pilgrimages were both painful and necessary, a way of maintaining her connection to the boy who had vanished on a perfect September afternoon. Michael Henderson's life took a different trajectory. The divorce and the unresolved loss drove him to alcoholism, though he eventually found sobriety through a 12-step program in 1999. He took a job as a security guard at the local high school, where he could keep an eye on the children of Millfield and perhaps prevent another family from experiencing the hell that had become his existence. Students found him kind but sad, a man whose eyes held secrets too painful to share. He lived alone in a small apartment above the hardware store, and every evening after work he would walk the streets where Tommy had once ridden his bike, as if routine and ritual could somehow bring his son back. As the 20th anniversary of Tommy's disappearance approached in 2011, the Millfield Gazette ran a retrospective article about the case. Reporter Janet Walsh interviewed the key players who were still alive and still willing to talk about that September day that had changed everything. The article revealed that Sarah had become a victims' rights advocate in Portland, that Michael was 8 years sober and working with at-risk youth, and that retired Agent Coleman still reviewed the case file from time to time. The piece also noted that several other children had gone missing in the Pacific Northwest during the early 1990s, though none of the cases appeared to be connected to Tommy's disappearance. The anniversary article generated renewed interest in the case, leading to several tips and a few false leads. A psychic from Seattle claimed to have visions of Tommy's location, leading search teams to a remote area near the Cascade Mountains, where they found nothing but old camping trash and abandoned car parts. A man in Arizona called to say he'd seen a boy matching Tommy's description at a truck stop in 1991. But the lead went nowhere when investigators discovered the man's history of mental illness and false reporting. A more promising lead came from a retired truck driver who claimed he'd given a ride to a blonde boy on a red bike near Millfield in September 1991. But memory and time had made the details too fuzzy to be useful. By 2015, Tommy Henderson would have been 32 years old, potentially married with children of his own. Sarah sometimes imagined what he might look like as an adult, whether he would still have that infectious laugh, whether he would have chosen to stay in Oregon or moved somewhere warm and sunny. These fantasies were both comforting and torturous, allowing her to imagine Tommy living a happy life somewhere, while simultaneously reminding her of all the milestones she'd missed: his first day of high school, his graduation, his wedding, grandchildren she would never meet. The 25th anniversary passed more quietly in 2016, with only a brief mention in the local newspaper and a small memorial service attended by a handful of people who still remembered. The case seemed destined to join the ranks of permanently unsolved mysteries, one of those tragedies that communities carry like scars, painful reminders of the random cruelties that can shatter ordinary lives without warning or explanation. The memorial bench in Central Park weathered and aged, the brass plaque bearing Tommy's name and dates growing green with oxidation. Millfield continued to grow and change around the ghost of Tommy Henderson. New subdivisions were built on former farmland, chain restaurants opened along the highway, and a small shopping center was proposed for the lot where Anderson's farm supply had once stood. The town council approved the development in 2019, seeing it as a sign of progress and economic growth that would bring jobs and tax revenue to their community. Environmental surveys were conducted, permits were obtained, and construction was scheduled to begin in spring 2021. It was during the excavation phase of the shopping center project that everything changed. On a crisp morning in April 2021, exactly 30 years and 7 months after Tommy Henderson's disappearance, a construction worker named Carlos Rivera was operating a backhoe when he noticed something unusual in the dirt. At first, he thought it was just debris or an old fence post, but as he cleared away more soil, he realized he was looking at something that didn't belong, buried 4 feet underground in what had been an empty field for decades. Carlos shut down his equipment and called over his supervisor, Janet Murray, a 15-year veteran of construction projects who'd seen her share of buried surprises. Old septic systems, forgotten utility lines, even the occasional historical artifact. But what she saw in the hole Carlos had dug made her stomach lurch with recognition and dread. Partially buried in the dark earth, corroded by 3 decades of weather and time, was a child's bicycle. Red paint was still visible in patches, though rust had claimed most of the frame, but it was the baseball cards, now yellowed and brittle, still attached to the spokes with old clothespins, that made Janet's hands shake as she reached for her phone. The bicycle was exactly 487 meters from the Henderson house, measured in a straight line through the woods that separated the construction site from Maple Street. It had been buried in what was once the edge of Miller's property, an area that had been thoroughly searched in 1991, but apparently not deeply enough. The location was significant for another reason. It was just beyond the boundary that Sarah Henderson had set for Tommy's bike rides, in an area where he wasn't supposed to go, but where an adventurous 8-year-old might have ventured if something interesting had caught his attention. The discovery of the bicycle brought Agent Coleman out of retirement and drew Sarah Henderson back to Millfield for the first time in 5 years. Michael Henderson, now 58 years old and working as a counselor for troubled youth, stood at the edge of the excavation site and wept openly as investigators carefully exhumed his son's most prized possession. The red BMX bike, even in its deteriorated condition, was unmistakably the same one Tommy had ridden away from home on September 15, 1991. The serial number matched the one Michael had recorded for insurance purposes, and several unique modifications that Tommy had made, including a small dent in the frame where he'd crashed into the mailbox the previous summer, confirmed its identity beyond any doubt. But the bicycle raised more questions than it answered. How had it ended up buried 4 feet underground, in a location that had been searched multiple times? Why was there no sign of Tommy himself? The burial appeared deliberate rather than accidental. The bike was positioned carefully, almost ceremonially, wrapped in what appeared to be the rotted remains of a plastic tarp. Soil analysis indicated it had been buried shortly after Tommy's disappearance, not recently. The area around the burial site was excavated with archaeological precision, but no human remains were found, no clothing, no other personal effects that might provide clues to Tommy's fate. The investigation was reopened with a team of specialists who brought 3 decades of technological advancement to bear on evidence that had been collected in 1991. DNA analysis was performed on soil samples, though results were inconclusive due to the age of the material and contamination from natural sources. Ground-penetrating radar was used to search the surrounding area for other buried objects or disturbances, revealing several anomalies that proved to be tree roots, old fence posts, and a long-buried farm implement. Cadaver dogs were brought in to search for any trace of human remains, but after 3 decades underground, any scent evidence had long since dissipated. The discovery generated intense media attention, bringing reporters from Portland, Seattle, and even national news networks to tiny Millfield. The Today Show did a segment on the case. America's Most Wanted featured it in their Unsolved Mysteries segment, and true crime podcasters from around the country descended on the town like locusts. The attention was overwhelming for a community that had spent 30 years trying to heal from the trauma of Tommy's disappearance. Sarah Henderson found herself thrust back into the spotlight. She'd spent decades trying to escape, while Michael struggled to maintain his privacy and his hard-won sobriety under the pressure of renewed scrutiny. One detail that emerged during the new investigation particularly troubled experts familiar with missing person cases. The careful burial of Tommy's bicycle suggested planning and deliberation rather than panic or spontaneous action. Someone had taken the time to dig a substantial hole, wrap the bike in plastic, and bury it deep enough to avoid accidental discovery. This level of preparation implied that whoever was responsible had experience with covering up evidence and had possibly been involved in similar crimes. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit developed a profile suggesting the perpetrator was likely a local resident, probably male, with some connection to the Henderson family or knowledge of Tommy's routines. The geographic location of the burial site also provided new insights. The spot was not visible from any road or house, but it could be accessed via an old logging trail that connected to the county road system about half a mile away. This suggested that whoever buried the bicycle had local knowledge of the area's geography and could transport evidence without being observed. The timing of the burial, almost certainly within days or weeks of Tommy's disappearance, indicated that the crime had been planned in advance rather than being a spontaneous act that got out of hand. Despite the renewed investigation and the technological resources available in 2021, the fundamental question remained unanswered. What had happened to Tommy Henderson? The bicycle's burial suggested that he had been murdered, but without human remains or additional physical evidence, investigators could not determine how, when, or why he had died. The case remained officially unsolved, though the discovery of the bicycle had provided the first concrete evidence in 30 years and had given investigators new avenues to explore. The psychological impact of the bicycle's discovery rippled through Millfield like an earthquake. Residents who had spent 3 decades wondering if Tommy had run away, been kidnapped by strangers, or simply gotten lost in the woods now faced the grim reality that he had almost certainly been murdered by someone who knew the area well enough to hide evidence effectively. The fact that the killer might still be living among them, might be someone they knew and trusted, transformed the community's sense of itself and its history. Neighbors began looking at each other with suspicion, wondering who among them might be capable of killing a child and living with that secret for 30 years. For Sarah Henderson, the discovery of Tommy's bicycle was both a blessing and a curse. After 3 decades of not knowing, she finally had proof that her son was dead, allowing her to begin a grieving process that had been frozen in uncertainty since 1991. But the knowledge that someone had deliberately murdered Tommy and had been free all these years was almost unbearable. She established a reward fund for information leading to the arrest and conviction of Tommy's killer, using her savings and donations from supporters around the country who had been following the case. The reward quickly grew to over $100,000, representing the largest bounty ever offered for information in a Millfield crime. Michael Henderson's reaction to the discovery was more complex. The bicycle represented both closure and renewed torment, confirmation of his worst fears, but also the first tangible connection to his son in 3 decades. He spent hours at the excavation site, staring into the hole where Tommy's bike had been buried, trying to understand how someone could kill a child and hide the evidence so effectively. The discovery challenged his faith in humanity and his belief that justice would eventually prevail, but it also gave him a new sense of purpose in seeking answers to questions that had haunted him for most of his adult life. The investigation team, led by Detective Sarah Martinez, Chief Martinez's daughter, who had grown up hearing about the Tommy Henderson case, pursued every possible lead generated by the bicycle's discovery. They re-interviewed witnesses from 1991, many now elderly and struggling with memory issues. They examined property records to determine who had owned or had access to the land where the bicycle was buried. They created a comprehensive timeline of everyone who had been in Millfield during September 1991, looking for patterns or connections that earlier investigators might have missed. The work was painstaking and often frustrating, but it represented the best chance in 30 years to solve the case that had defined the community's modern history. One particularly disturbing aspect of the new investigation was the discovery that the area around the bicycle burial site had been used as an informal dumping ground for various items over the years. In addition to typical rural trash, old appliances, car parts, construction debris, investigators found several items that didn't belong: children's toys, clothing, and personal effects that had no obvious connection to the families who had lived in the area. While none of these items could be definitively linked to other crimes, their presence suggested that the location had been used multiple times by someone who knew it would be safe from discovery. The case attracted the attention of criminal profilers and behavioral analysts from around the country, many of whom offered their services pro bono in hopes of finally solving the 30-year-old mystery. Dr. Amanda Foster, a forensic psychologist from the University of Oregon, spent weeks in Millfield studying the case files and interviewing residents. Her analysis suggested that Tommy's killer was likely someone with a deep knowledge of the local area, possibly someone who had grown up in Millfield or had lived there for many years. The careful burial of the bicycle indicated planning and preparation, suggesting this was not the perpetrator's first crime. The media attention surrounding the bicycle discovery also brought forward several new witnesses who had been children themselves in 1991 and had either forgotten or not understood the significance of what they had seen. A woman named Linda Crawford, now 45 but 8 years old at the time of Tommy's disappearance, remembered seeing a man with a bike in the woods near Miller's property on the day Tommy vanished. Her memory was fragmentary. She remembered being frightened by something about the man's behavior, but couldn't recall specific details. Under careful questioning by trained investigators, Linda was able to provide enough information to generate a composite sketch, though the passage of 30 years made the reliability of such memories questionable. Another witness who came forward was James Mitchell, who had been a teenager in 1991 and was now a successful businessman living in California. James remembered seeing someone burning what appeared to be clothing or fabric in a barrel behind an abandoned house near the area where the bicycle was found. At the time, he had thought nothing of it. Burning trash was common in rural areas, and the house had been vacant for several years. But in light of the bicycle discovery, the incident took on potential significance. Unfortunately, the house had been demolished in the mid-1990s, and any physical evidence that might have been present was long gone. The renewed investigation also revealed gaps and oversights in the original 1991 search efforts that were understandable given the resources available at the time, but frustrating in retrospect. The area where the bicycle was found had been searched by volunteers, but not with the systematic thoroughness that modern investigators would employ. Ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, and soil analysis techniques that were routine in 2021 had been either unavailable or prohibitively expensive 30 years earlier. This raised the disturbing possibility that other evidence might still be buried in areas that had been searched but not thoroughly excavated. As the investigation progressed through 2021 and into 2022, it became increasingly clear that solving Tommy Henderson's murder would require either a confession, additional physical evidence, or a witness willing to break 30 years of silence. The bicycle had provided crucial confirmation that Tommy was dead and had been murdered, but it had not pointed investigators toward a specific suspect. The case remained active, with Detective Martinez and her team continuing to follow leads and re-examine evidence. But the trail that had gone cold in 1991 remained stubbornly resistant to modern investigative techniques. The impact on the Henderson family was profound and lasting. Sarah Henderson, now in her 70s, found a measure of peace in knowing that Tommy was dead rather than living somewhere without contact with his family. But the knowledge that his killer remained free was a burden she carried every day. She became an advocate for cold case investigations and missing children's causes, using her experience to help other families navigate the complex emotions and practical challenges of having a missing loved one. Her work provided meaning and purpose, but could never fill the Tommy-shaped hole in her heart. Michael Henderson, approaching retirement age, channeled his renewed grief and anger into his work with troubled youth. His own experience with loss and trauma gave him unique insight into the pain that could drive young people to destructive behavior. He never spoke publicly about the bicycle discovery, but those who knew him well could see how it had affected him. The hope he had maintained for 30 years, that Tommy might still be alive somewhere, had been replaced by a grim certainty that his son had been murdered by someone who had never been held accountable. The case also had a lasting impact on the Millfield community, forcing residents to confront uncomfortable questions about safety, trust, and the nature of evil in small towns. The idea that Tommy's killer might still be living among them, might be someone they saw at the grocery store or church, someone whose children they had taught or worked alongside, was profoundly disturbing. Some residents moved away, unable to live with the uncertainty and suspicion that the case had rekindled. Others became more involved in community safety efforts, organizing neighborhood watch programs and pushing for better communication systems for missing person emergencies. The story of Tommy Henderson's disappearance and the discovery of his bicycle became a cautionary tale about the vulnerability of children and the importance of community vigilance. It also highlighted the limitations of investigative technology and techniques available in earlier decades, and how cases that seemed unsolvable at the time might yield new evidence as methods improved. The case was featured in law enforcement training programs as an example of how physical evidence could remain hidden for decades before technology advanced enough to find and analyze it properly.